The awesome website earnityourself.com hooked me up with the charity Feed Our Children Now, and I was able to get in for free, volunteer the whole day, and well, for most of the day, and then for the rest of the day, I got to interview some amazing people. I got to talk with Kevin Lyman, the founder of Warped Tour, Bethany Lynn, who is the press manager, I Fight Dragons, Derek from Mayday Parade, Stephen and Dave from Echo Movement, and Elijah from the Constellations. It was a truly amazing experience. You can watch all of the interviews that I conducted on my channel right now. And the link to my article with earnityourself.com is in the description below. There are some things that I left out of the article due to space issues, and they were kind of irrelevant to the article that I was tapped to do, which was volunteer and interview people, so that's what I wrote about in my article. Before these interviews, I had only really interviewed one person before, and that was a friend's mom for an oral history assignment, so it was totally in a different arena when it comes to interviewing people, interviewing a friend's mom versus interviewing famous people who you love and adore. I did some research beforehand to see what kind of questions were normally asked, and so I would know what questions not to ask, and that prep work paid off. At one point, the press lady told me that I had good questions, and I was totally taken aback by the compliment because she probably watches 20 interviews being conducted a day, probably more, depending on what the venue is, and she told me that I had good questions, so I was really humbled by that. And that huge compliment also told me that I was doing something right. And I wasn't sure if I was. I felt like I was doing something good, but at the same time, I was new at it. I didn't know if what I was doing was along the right lines. At one point, and I can't remember how it came up, but she mentioned a YouTuber who interviews tons of musicians and bands, and she said that he wasn't a very good interviewer. I was surprised by this because in prep for my interviews, I watched some of his stuff to see what kind of questions were normally asked, and I didn't think that he was that bad. I told her that I watched some of his stuff in prep for my interviews, and so that I could see what questions people ask so that I know what not to ask. And she was like, "Oh, so you watched him to figure out what not to do?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she just thought that was really funny. But I kind of think that that's the way the interview should go, is that you should research what questions are asked so that you know what not to ask, because the interviews must get boring for the people who are being interviewed if they're asked the same questions over and over again. So it's definitely worth the prep time to figure out what has not been asked before. I learned a lot of things about interviewing throughout the day, but one of the, I think, most important things is that it really matters how you phrase a question. One of my questions that I asked everyone was how to become like kind of popular or get your name out there in your local music scene. And a lot of people thought that I meant like Hot Topic scene kids, and that like that kind of music, but I was just talking about the music community in general, like local music. And so that was something that I figured out that I was phrasing the question wrong. Another important tip is to act like you know and care about the musicians and the bands or whoever you're interviewing, because that is a huge deal. Even if you don't know them, still be emotionally invested in it, and still care about what you're doing and care about who they are and what they do. It's relatively easy to come up with deep questions that can apply to more than one person. However, this is no substitute for prep or research. You still need to do those things, but you also need to be flexible and be able to do improv. Chances are that you might not be able to interview the person that you're going in to interview. And if that's the case, then you need to interview somebody else. And even if you can get the person interviewing that you want to interview, why not interview some other people that you may not know? And I think that's especially true if you're doing something like Warped Tour, where there are tons of bands and your musical horizons are being broadened just by being there. And if you are talking to bands that you've never heard of before, or maybe you just have done a little bit of research, I think that's a great opportunity, not only helping yourself, but also helping the band get their name out there. I think that's really, really important. And now for a random fact. One of the funniest things about being behind the scenes is seeing people that you love and adore and pretending like it's no big deal. Like when I saw the whole band of Taking Back Sunday and the whole band of The Used, and I was just like, whew. But you do that internally. You don't make those weird noises, and you don't show that you're like freaking out. Also, that's a good tip. Being behind the scenes is like being in their safe spot. Do not violate their safe spot by being a total fangirl or a total fanboy. Don't do that. Instead, show your appreciation through thought out, level headed conversation and questions. They really do appreciate when you're a fan of their music and when you're having a normal conversation. You're not like, oh, can I get a picture with you? Like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I do that all the time. But when you're doing an interview, it's like a business thing. And so you need to have that kind of boundary, and I think that's important. I stayed for the entire concert, and once that was done, I headed back to my mom-mobile, or minivan in common vernacular, and I got in my car, and there was a group of 2 guys and 2 girls that were about my age standing outside. Well, they looked like they wanted to talk to me. So I rolled down my window, and then one of the guys was like, do you mind giving us a ride back to our hotel? And I was like, okay. And I normally don't say okay. This is totally unlike me. But I figured that it's 2 guys and 2 girls my age. If it was 2 guys my age, that would be a different thing. But 2 guys and 2 girls, I thought that's a pretty good, safe thing because of where we are. We're not in a big city or anything. So I figured that seems pretty harmless. Also, he offered me $20. And I figured that I would pass by the part of town with all the motels on my way to the highway anyway. So I was like, it's no big deal. It's also worth noting that when he got in the car, he was like, oh, I only have $10 instead of 20. I was like, okay, it's all good, whatever. They were super grateful the whole 10-minute ride. They were like, oh, thank you. It would have cost so much money to get a taxi and everything. And I'm like, it's all cool. It's all good. And we also had lively conversation for the whole 10 minutes. I learned a lot about them. They learned a lot about me. We didn't exchange contact information, so just like totally no strings attached kind of thing, which is kind of weird, but awesome at the same time. And maybe it was just the residual effects of Warped Tour, because Warped Tour has a very community atmosphere. Whether you are just being there as an attendee, or whether you are behind the scenes and you're seeing all the bands, talk to each other and everything. It's really a great atmosphere. And they asked me why I would do that, why I would give them a ride, and I was like, for the good of humanity, and they just thought that was hilarious. But that's why I did it. I didn't do it for the $10. I don't care about $10. I mean, I don't have a job, but $10, is whatever. And so I thought it was definitely for just to be cool about it. It's awesome to also to give my school a good rep, because they're from the north part of the state, we're in the south part of the state, and they go to my rival school, and so I go to their rival school. And so it was pretty cool to establish that kind of connection, because I've never really known anyone from their school, so I was like, oh, they're really nice people, and hopefully they think the same about my school now too. Obviously that was not an intention, it was just kind of a side effect. So really, I did it for the good of humanity and $10, but mostly for the good of humanity. Thank you for watching, I really appreciate it. Also, I have a random update. I'm going to go to Virginia, DC, New York, Virginia, DC, and then back here. Sunday, fly to Virginia. Monday, DC, which will be exciting because there's a lot of crap happening on that day. Then the next day, drive to New York. The next 2 days, be in New York. The next day, drive back to Virginia. And then the next 4 days, be in DC by myself for a conference without my family. It's awesome traveling by yourself, because then you don't have to worry about, oh my god, where are the other 5 people? We need to get to our airplane, our gate. We have to find the stinking gate. We have to get through security. There's so many people. Oh my god. But when you're one person, I'm me. I'm not going to lose myself. I don't think. That would be really interesting, but I'm not going to lose myself. I get to keep an eye on my stuff as opposed to the 5 other people and their crap too. So that'll be fun. I'm going to be photographing and videographing everything the whole time. So there won't be Throwback Thursdays for like 2 weeks probably. But maybe. I don't know. It depends on if I have an internet connection or not. But yeah, so that'll be cool. So be excited for that. But again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Thumbs up, man. thumbs up.